All right. Hi, everybody. This is a brief lecture on some of the main ideas about gender development. So, there's a lot more to it that was in the book. So, this is just a very broad overview. So, first, I just want to talk about what gender and gender identity is. Um, Sex is generally associated with anatomy. So, being a male or female is generally associated with sexual anatomy, reproductive anatomy that you are either born with or that you develop later in life. And that can happen through surgery too for sex reassignment. Um, uh, Surgery will change your sex, not just your gender. Gender is more the social construction, includes how one identifies with their own gender and how others identify you as well. So it's partly um, the perception of others about what your gender is, because that affects how you're treated. Even if you identify as a boy, if others think that you're a girl, they're going to treat you as a girl. And so gender is both your own views and others' views of you. And there's a variety of different gender identities. There's cisgender, which is when your gender identity matches the anatomy that you were born with and your sexual assignment at birth. Transgender is when you identify as the opposite gender of what your sexual anatomy that you were born with. Non-binary, meaning you're not feeling tied to either one gender or the other. Gender fluid refers to shifting gender identities depending on context and situation. Bigender, meaning that you identify with parts of both gender identities, and agender, meaning that you don't identify with any particular gender category. A lot of people conflate gender identity and sexual identity. They're very different, so don't make that mistake. The timing of gender development generally goes like this. In the first year, kids recognize that there's distinct groups representing different genders, even if they're not necessarily sure what the genders mean. They do recognize that the groups are distinct. In the second year, kids show recognition of different sex type behaviors and preferences, like preferring dolls or trucks. Third year, begin using gender labels to identify people in themselves. Fourth and fifth years start to build stereotypes about traits that are specific to girls and boys. And so not just like girls like dolls and boys like trucks, but also personality traits. At 4 and 5 years, kids generally lack gender constancy, meaning that kids aren't necessarily sure that your gender is the same. Like if you get your hair cut, that might change your gender. And there's increases in gender segregation. In the 6th year, gender constancy develops, and there is continued gender stereotyping, but there's a little bit more flexibility as kids realize that, like, okay, football is more of a boy thing than a girl thing, but not all boys are into football, and some girls are into football, so they start to realize there's some flexibility there. Around 9 or 10, kids understand that gender roles are social constructions and not rigid. They're not necessarily invariable and not things that can't be changed, but are actually things that are more mentally constructed and socially constructed than biologically determined. Nonetheless, there's still gender segregation and developing gender norm behavior based on the larger culture. So this idea that in society, this is what's valued for boys and this is what's valued for girls, that really starts to develop around 9 or 10 years old. And then in adolescence, there's what's known as gender role intensification. And this is often tied to dating and sexuality scripts. So this is where if you stray from your perceived gender role, you will start to get hassled for it. And so kids will often do things like girls who might have dressed sort of androgynously as children will start to feel the pressure to dress more sex stereotypically, and will feel some of that pressure internally from themselves as well. And there's an increase in mixed gender friendship groups in adolescence as well. Several different theories of gender development. The biological one is really saying that gender development is the result of hormones and genetics. And then there's these different cognitive theories. Kohlberg has a stage theory that says gender identity develops through first identifying which gender you are, then recognizing that your gender isn't likely to change, and then recognizing that it is constant across situations and contexts. And that leads to a major search for, okay, so what is gender appropriate behavior? Gender schema theory doesn't really go in stages. It just says that we are constantly, from birth, basically developing and refining our schemas for what gender means and what our own gender identity is. And we filter new information through our existing gender schema. Social cognitive theory says that we learn about our genders and gender appropriate behavior through tuition, that is direct instruction. Parents teaching you this is what you should do as a boy or a girl. An active experience which is where we do things and then responds to that by telling us that's either gender appropriate or not. And observational learning, where we observe other people behaving in gendered ways. And then social identity theory is this sort of in-group and bias and assimilation. So once you decide which gender you are, you have a bias that says that gender is better than the other gender, and you have an in-group assimilation process where you really try and learn, this is what's appropriate for my gender, let me act appropriately. Of course, intersectionality, meaning that people have multiple identities, and sometimes intersectionality puts gender identity in conflict with other identity. For example, developing a sense of feminism, but being in a very traditional family with specific gender roles can put your cultural identity and your gender identity in conflict. That's one example. Finally, social influences of gender development. The bioecological model is useful here for considering multiple influences on gender identity. There is physical and biological processes, so a lot of gender identity happens just through physical maturation. Your body changes and it makes you think about your gender in a different way. It's a big deal in adolescence in particular. Cognitive development, the ability to think categorically, reflectively, and ultimately abstractly. So categorically, recognizing there's different genders, and then reflectively thinking about how your own behavior fits into a gender or not. And then abstractly is this idea that people can behave in multiple ways even within a specific gender identity. So being male or being female or being agender or being bigender, that these things don't mean that everybody in those categories has to act the exact same way, that there are multiple ways to act in multiple gender identities. Family is a major socializing influence, as are peers, and then obviously society as well. Media presents images of what appropriate gendered behavior is, and there's policies in society, jobs, earnings, all these things affect gender development and gender identity. Okay, that is it. Quick and dirty lecture on gender identity.